La primera mesa sobre Oriente, Medio y la geopolítica del norte de África va a estar moderada por Cristina Manzano. Cristina Manzano, licenciada en Periodismo por la Universidad Complutense, hizo un posgrado en la University of Maryland con una beca Fulbright. Miembro del European Council of Foreign Relations del Consejo Científico del Elcano y del Consejo del Capítulo Español del Club de Roma. Cristina Manzano es la directora de ESGLOBAL, la publicación digital líder de asuntos globales en español. Es columnista del País, tiene un blog en la edición española del Huffington Post y colabora regularmente en otros medios, como el Periódico de Cataluña. Y ya Cristina presentará a los demás ponentes de la mesa, Gonzalo, Escribano, David, Ramin y Emre, Iseri. Adelante, por favor. Estén listos.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As you all know, we will be dealing in this roundtable with geopolitics. In the previous conversation, I just heard a question about how geopolitics impacts on energy, and I always wonder how energy impacts on geopolitics, and I think both are so much intertwined that we cannot separate one from the other. We are also focusing, as you all know, on 3 specific countries. We are going to talk about Algeria, we are going to talk about Iran, and we are going to talk about Turkey, which are also in a very specific political moment. Turkey had just their elections. President Erdogan was just re-elected with new powers. Iran will be facing legislative elections in 2020, but at the same time they are facing now the entry of the sanctions by the United States, which opens a new completely landscape in the region, especially for the country. And Algeria will be having also presidential elections next year, which open a completely new phase in the country. At the same time, we've seen, as we've heard previously, there is a new cycle in the energy prices, in the oil prices, and we want to see how they affect us. As you know, we will be talking about all these issues with Gonzalo Escribano, which is Senior Analyst and Director of the Program of Energy and Climate Change of the Royal Elcano Institute, which is the main think tank here in Spain. We also, of course, you know that you have all their series at large in the web page, so I won't go through them. We also have David Ramin Jalilvand, which is an independent consultant and research associate of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And to my direct right, we have Emre, which is the chair of the Department of International Relations at Yasar University in Izmir. Before we move on, just 2 announcements. Please, you know that you have the Slido to make questions, but you also have papers in your folder, so if you want to make questions after we have our previous conversation, please do it. And I also have to tell you that we have, in your Slido, you have a question that we want you to answer. We want you to vote. I thought it could be here, but I will read the question. In your opinion, from the energy geopolitics perspective, the MENA region will, 1, lose geopolitical relevance, 2, gain geopolitical relevance, or 3, keep being a major geopolitical player as they are now. If you vote during the session, at the end we will comment on your answers. Before we start, I just wanted to have a very, very quick overview of each of the countries. What is the specific moment we are living in Turkey, please?
At the moment, we are having a kind of a crisis in Turkey. We've been discussing with David about that. Turkish lira lost about 30% against dollar. So it means that Turkey is a net energy importer country, oil in terms of natural gas. So having difficulty in terms of balancing its current account deficit in particular at the moment. On the geopolitical part of the story, we are at the moment, this Idlib issue is high on the agenda. Apart from that, this Eastern Mediterranean, maybe we will discuss about that, is high on the agenda. What will be the future of those sources, which pipelines that would be utilized in the coming years are the things that high on the agenda at the moment. And maybe you are familiar, we had the presidential system now. So it's mainly turned out to be state-led capitalism in many ways. So that's state logic dominates the capital logic in that sense. Maybe we will also discuss that, how energy, foreign policy interacts in that sense under that framework.
Thank you. What about Iran? Where are we?
Thank you so much, Cristina. Allow me to begin perhaps by stating the very obvious, the fact that Iran is confronted with the return of sanctions imposed by the United States following the announcement of President Donald Trump in May this year to leave the nuclear deal, or more precisely to violate the United Nations Security Council resolution that is the nuclear deal. Sanctions are coming back now in two phases. A first phase was already implemented at the beginning of August this year, targeting largely Iranian government finance, but also the country's automotive industry. A second set of sanctions targeting the broader economy will become effective at the beginning of November, on November 5th, targeting crucial sectors of the Iranian economy, including energy, finance, but also shipping and insurance. The impact of these sanctions, both politically and economically, are already there. We saw Iranian oil exports declining. We see Western companies, not just energy companies, but companies in general, leaving the country, and we see inflation skyrocketing in Iran. And politically speaking, this puts tremendous pressure on the government of President Hassan Rouhani, who embarked both in 2013 and in 2017 on a campaign that promised to negotiate first a nuclear deal, and secondly, on the basis of that nuclear deal, to reintegrate Iran into the global economy and to promote economic growth. And all these achievements are, in a sense, gone now. As such, it's a major setback for the government, which domestically also sees itself under tremendous pressure, since there's always been a camp in Iran that argued it is not possible to strike a deal with the United States and then implement it. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in terms of Iran's geopolitics? I suspect that Iran will continue to stay in the nuclear deal for two reasons. First, the European Union, despite all the flaws of its approach, is trying to work towards maintaining and safeguarding trade with Iran. And even if the level of trade is not where Iran wants to see it, that momentum still exists. And now Europe and Iran are trying ways to save whatever is left of trade between the two sides. And that would be gone if Iran would have left the nuclear deal. And secondly, now there's a situation that in the major dossier of international affairs, 4 out of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are sharing Iran's position. That's a novel situation. Normally, Iran was finding itself confronting these 5 powers alone. Now 4 of them are on Iran's side. In terms of regional policy, oftentimes this summit has been debated whether or not the reduced revenues at the disposal of the Iranian government will lead to a scale back of Iran's engagement in the Middle East. I personally don't think that will be the case, simply because the rationale and the reasons why Iran is engaged in the Middle East have not changed. And if you look at this weekend's terrorist attack in Ahvaz, which, to put it very mildly, is not necessarily in contradiction with statements we heard from Mohammed bin Salman or John Bolton, that sense of fear in Iran about what would happen if Iran would withdraw from the region and possibly open a vacuum that would be filled by others, that rationale is still there. Mm-hmm. Lastly, perhaps on energy, on the geopolitics of energy, we saw, parallel to the decline of Iranian oil exports, that both Saudi Arabia and Russia, fellow OPEC members, have increased their own production. And the signals we hear from Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia is messaging that they would offer substitutes for Iranian oil to the extent that this is needed. This has implications, of course, in terms of energy markets, and the question up is to which extent this will eat into Saudi spare capacity and possibly put pressure on prices. But also in terms of the geopolitics of the region, that is obviously an interesting development, considering that both Russia and Saudi Arabia, together with Iran, are important players in the Middle East. So, by and large, a very interesting geopolitical mélange.
Yeah, it certainly is. What about Algeria?
At this very moment, they should be wearing the handover of the OPEC meeting, probably. But to some extent, I think Algeria is living a relatively sweet moment. I mean, I remember some years ago with David, he was the editor of a wonderful book on the geopolitics of the Middle East, energy and all that. I don't remember the exact title, but I recommend you all to buy it. And at that very moment, some 2-3 years ago, there were a huge how to say, a lot of worries about what will be the fate of Algeria. A lot of people thinking that they will fall back in the same problems of revolutionary conflict that in the 90s and all this lost decade because of the reduction in prices that it happened at the end of the 80s. There were even a lot of think tankers writing on different scenarios. I mean, the Egyptian scenario, coup d'etat on Algeria, the civil war scenario going back to the 90s, we really didn't buy it. I mean, we really thought that Algeria was, to some extent, stronger than most people expected. But on the other side, it's true that today, when you look at Mr. Bouteflika, that is probably facing his 5th election, who was told, 2-3 years ago, that he will be in such a good position, to regain elections again and again. I mean, so that's funny, to some extent. But on the other side, it's a bit worrying that even if Algeria has, let's say, survived this round, what will happen in the future? Because the economic reforms, the energy reforms are getting somehow not that much incentivized as they were before because of the, low level of prices, just 1 year ago. And some of the signs we are seeing these days in Algeria is, okay, the budget for this year, okay, we are going to elections, so we don't want nothing about adjustment and so on and so forth. This poses problems in the consistency of the economic policy. Regarding energy, the whole sector here have been waiting for the energy reform, for the new hydrocarbon law for years. Now we know, just a couple of days ago it was announced that probably Algeria will have a new hydrocarbon law by the end of this year, beginning of the next year. But we already know that there won't be fundamental changes. There will be no change in the most significant measure, that is the 4951. The obligation by Sonatrach or national companies to hold 51% of all projects. This is really disturbing. But probably other points they are saying they will address some of the other shortcomings, like, bureaucracy, red tape, and all these kind of things. Probably tax issues and so on and so forth, in order not to make so costly to companies or so less attractive for companies to invest in Algeria when you got high or lower prices. These differences in prices, to change the system. In any case, my forecast, and I will close on that, my forecast is that we won't see nothing really happening in Algeria's energy policy until April. The Algerians have been selling the energy spring in the country. For sure they don't use this name because anything called a spring in North Africa now is not very, sexy. Yeah? But they try to develop this narrative, or now we are changing, we are much closer to the international energy companies, we are good friends now again with the French, and so on and so forth. We want to start to develop new projects with the Americans on shale, and so on and so forth. But all this won't be implemented, in my opinion, until we don't get a clear result, a clear solution when we got these elections in spring.
But you've made a very, very short forecast because that only goes until April, until the election. And there are many bets. Will Bouteflika run again? You mentioned that he might, probably. If so, will the country really be willing to, will the government really be willing to enforce those reforms? If there is a change in power, we'll see, can we expect any real changes? Will they take advantage of the new cycle of oil prices? What do you think? What is the atmosphere there? Is there real appetite for change, even if Bouteflika is still in power?
Well, there is always a struggle within Algeria between reformers and conservatives. So this struggle will be there. My conjecture is that probably once the presidential elections have been solved and Bouteflika, if he is still alive, or probably somebody from the regime very close to it, nothing surprising is going to happen, they will have the political stability to look ahead for 4 or 5 years. They will have an improved economic situation. They will have more policy space to do different things that they have not been able to do in the last 2-3 years. And with this horizon, probably reformers, perhaps this is my hope, reformers will be able to move forward faster and more consistently. That's my hope. But on the other side, we also need to tell to the European Union and also to our French friends, hey guys, you have to give a horizon to the Algerians. If our discourse, our narrative is, we don't want your gas, we are going just for renewables. We don't want interconnections, Frenchies, we don't want interconnections with Spain, so you cannot export through Spain, or Italy, or whatever. If we don't give them some incentives to move forward, to profit from their own reforms, is going to be much more difficult. That's my point. You know? I mean, we have been discussing that several times, and my point is the Algerians should do more, but we in Europe should offer them a clearer perspective.
Talking about Europe and perspectives, what about Turkey? Because with the re-election of Erdogan, with the new state of the, well, new, since the coup d'etat of 2016, with all the developments in the country, what is the situation in Turkey now regarding energy and the neighbors and the possibilities of having a better or not relation with the European Union?
You mentioned the coup attempt. It has significant geopolitical implications then onwards, because there were two countries that called Erdogan just after the coup. One is Qatar, the other one is Putin. So when we are trying to understand Turkey's energy policies, we should be familiar with the context in that regard. So from the perspective of Ankara, Russia and Qatar are the two allies. But when, and Erdogan then he made a speech about that, wait for a phone from Brussels, wait from Washington, but that call did not come. So when we are trying to analyze Turkey's policies regarding to European Union, US, and also Turkey's energy policies, its intensified energy links with Russia, this Turkish stream is on the way. Russians will be building the first nuclear power plant in Turkey. On the one hand, you see that in the official discourse, in energy discourse, you hear about diversifying your procurement diversification, diversifying away from Russia maybe, but when you look at the practicality at the end of the day, Turkey's dependence on Russia in energy terms, in natural gas, is now about 55%, and also in case of nuclear, even though our Turkish government officials are saying that it's local, but we know that it will be a Russian nuclear power plant. The source uranium will come from Russia again. So in that regard, we can, in my humble opinion, it creates a kind of double dependency in energy terms. And in that context, it becomes quite complicated for Turkey to act out of the dictates of Russia in the region. So that's how your foreign policy ambitions, but in your energy, your dependence on Russia becomes your, in a way, a burden for you, a liability in the region when you were dealing with Syria. So as I told you, it was one of the hot issues.
Let me ask you regarding this. How is this very close relationship with Russia in every sense affecting the relationship of Turkey with the NATO?
Yeah, that's another issue. I remember it was, I think, last year. There was a debate about whether Turkey will withdraw from NATO. But whenever you've been reading official speeches, always think about the domestic side as well. Because in Turkey, we have quite large portion of the society is anti-NATO, about 50, 60, anti-America, United States. In many ways, so for public consumption, and if we are on the eve of elections, whenever a governmental official is speaking, maybe NATO will think that it's directly talking to that. Actually, it's for domestic consumption. So we always need to see that double game, that two games that politicians in Turkey are playing. So maybe you need to, in a way, adjust the expectations of domestic population. So with the expectation that you will gain the lion's share on. So we are living the age of populism, post-truth world in a way. So we always bear in mind that. So rather than taking seriously.
David, talking about expectations, I also wanted to know, to ask you how the economic sanctions and how the economic situation of Iran right now, the not improvement, just the opposite, is affecting the population and their support of the regime. But also I wanted to ask you about the role of Iran as a regional power and this constant competition, both with Saudi Arabia, but also with Turkey. I mean, we are seeing a game, a very interesting game of alliances for one purpose and disagreements on other purposes. So how is Iran tackling this?
Sure. Speaking about expectations, we also have to speak about hope in the Iranian population and hope that existed parallel to the conclusion of the nuclear deal and following the implementation of the nuclear deal at the beginning of 2016. Expectations in Iran among average Iranians, I would say, as for what the nuclear deal would bring about in terms of economic progress, were vastly exaggerated, partly also because the government previously had put all the blame for Iran's economic problems on the sanctions. So expectations have been too high anyway. And then, of course, we can have a debate as to whether or not the progress was in the maximum possible way that one could have realized potentially. What we do see in the years between 2015 and, say, this summer, since the conclusion of the nuclear deal and the US announcement to leave the deal and to bring back sanctions, we saw that Iran's economy was on a path of robust real GDP growth. Oil exports have recovered to pre-sanctions levels, and importantly, for average Iranians, the Rouhani government succeeded in bringing under control inflation from above 40% to a single-digit figure. And that's something that impacted the lives of average Iranians. Still, economic growth and foreign trade was below the level that would have been needed to kind of solve the major problems of Iran's economy. There is still large unemployment, officially at 12%, but de facto much higher, especially among the youth. And this situation has not really changed. And even before the US announcement to leave the nuclear deal, there was a fair degree of frustration among many Iranians about the slow progress of economic recovery. Now, with the US decision to leave the deal, things are worse, dramatically worse. I was in Tehran a couple of times this summer, and speaking to taxi drivers, to ordinary people, you sense a large level of frustration. Which is partly, of course, attributed to the government, because I always compare Iran to an onion. One part of the problems is sanctions and the international arena, but many problems, mismanagement, corruption, etc., inefficiencies, are domestically. But I would say there's also a certain segment of Iranian society, and I can't put a figure to it, but that sees that it was not necessarily the government's fault that the nuclear deal is now collapsing and that things are developing in the direction they are now going. But to put it short, the pressure on the people and struggling to make a life is extremely high and growing by the day. In terms of regional policies and Iran's engagement, again, this summer had a debate on whether or not Iran now would scale back its engagements in places like Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And frankly, I don't see that the rationale in Iran has changed to do so, as mentioned before. Quite to the contrary, concerns about a potential conspiracy between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are growing. Security fears have risen, and as such, the risks of giving up certain influence in the region and then see someone else, whoever that might be, filling up that room are growing and would rather not invite Iran to withdraw at this point in time. Also, in terms of the domestic policies, the hands of those in Tehran who have always argued that we can strike deals and implement them is weakened. So after the collapse, or the de facto political collapse of the nuclear deal, Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani are not necessarily in a strong position domestically to argue now we can strike a deal with whoever from our adversaries to overcome these solutions politically. Still, I think Europe's role is important, and that's also one aspect that's overlooked at times, the fact that since the conclusion of the nuclear deal, there are now regular high-level exchanges between European and Iranian officials on matters of foreign and security policy. And this momentum of dialogue, which not necessarily solves all problems, but at least that gives a way for negotiations is there and can be built on from a European perspective. Final point perhaps on Turkey, because I think the Iranian-Turkish relationship in many respects is fascinating. both sides find each other on opposing ends in the Syrian conflict, supporting different conflicting parties. But unlike in many, I would say, or most foreign policy relationships in the Middle East, that did not spoil the overall Turkish-Iranian relationship. Trade has been growing between both sides, political exchanges have been kept, and this compartmentalization of the Syrian conflict, not allowing the crisis there affect all other issues on the agenda between Iran and Turkey, is something that is very important, I would say unique in the Middle East, because normally when countries are at odds, they're really at odds.
I have something to add, actually. There's actually a historical lesson for both Iran and Turkey. 400 years, more or less, the border was same. So they are more or less equal powers in the region. So they always try to balance each other without directly confronting each other. So they are very good at compartmentalizing their issues. On the one hand, they have their economic ties, maybe they have their political problems. So, but never ever directly confront each other. They are always hesitant on that.
Let me ask you this, both. Do you think that good relationship and strange thing in the region has to do with the fact that none of those countries is Arab, and they are fighting the other Arab regional powers, or no?
In my humble opinion, I always think about those identity issues as a tool of politics. So rather than, it's always sometimes you overemphasize your identity. But in our case, I think it's rather than being identity politics, it's more to do with interests. So Iran regards its markets. Turkey regards Iran to diversify, I mentioned, its energy portfolio. So in that regard, we need to think about in that terms rather than identity.
Do you agree?
Yes, I would reject the ethnic explanation for that conflict, and I would pin it to more historical reasons in the fact that both Iran and Turkey have functioning states to varying degrees, but as an entity with largely with the size of their current territories, they have existed for very long. And then a number of also other factors. Iran has a large ethnic Azeri Turkish minority that is taking part in Iranian society. The supreme leader of Iran is of Azeri background, and the Azeri people, especially of Iran, always serve as a bridge between the two countries. So there is this perhaps ethnic moment, but the overall reason why relations have been rather constructive is that the respective interests and also the broader situation have allowed them to engage with this type of foreign policy, whereas, for example, Iraq is struggling to act as an integrated state in the first place. So it's much more difficult to have constructive relations in that sense there.
Okay. Gonzalo, how is Algeria coping with instability in its very, very close neighborhood, especially with Libya, but also with what is happening in the south, all those troubles, illegal markets, illegal immigration, everything coming from the south, from the desert? How is Algeria coping with that? And do you think it can still handle it for the next year?
We hope so, because that
we hope so.
will be a fundamental threat. Yeah? Again, 2-3 years ago, or even before, through the Arab Spring and all that, there were huge concerns. You remember the In Amenas plant attack, a gas plant attack in the south of Algeria. There were huge concerns whether Algeria will get into chaos because of the, pressure from either the Sahel or either Libya. And surely they have done a huge effort. They have spent hundreds of millions of dinars, making a much better system of surveillance, trying to put a lot of people from the army. They have increased the army role in order to put more people surveying the borders and so on and so forth. But for sure, the situation is still very complicated. The Algerians have been complaining about the mess. They say we Europeans and NATO and everybody, but then made in Libya, to some extent they are right. To some extent they are right. The question is what should have been done. Or what you were doing in order to prevent that. But to some extent the result is far from being very I mean, this is, as you perfectly know, the Libyan, not only the oil production, but the country itself is like a roller coaster. You know, one day they grasp one refinery. The other day they attack the siege of the national oil company. The other day, I mean, it's very difficult to deal with that. Well, I would have said unfortunately, but fortunately, from the market perspective, this geopolitical risk premium has been, let's say, discounted by the market. So whatever happens today in Libya doesn't move much more the market, in my opinion, you know, because it has been already discounted. But we have also to acknowledge that the Algerians have done a huge job in containing this at the Libyan borders, also at the Tunisian borders in the mountains, and also in the Sahel. Perhaps we don't like the way they did it, but they have done the job.
We didn't ask.
We didn't ask. We didn't want to know.
Exactly.
We didn't want to know. Still today in Algeria, every day when you look at the news, you got terrorist attack. I mean, you got terrorists being killed. It's not solved. But the question is nothing to do with what has happened 10 years ago. I mean, those of you who go to Algeria, I mean, it's nice going in the underground, you know, going in the tram, having a walk in the, you know, in the city. When you go in the car, you don't have to light the interior lights every time you cross a control because there is not that much controls anymore. So life for Algerians have improved greatly in terms of security, not necessarily in economic terms. So the situation has improved. They have done a job, I mean, whether we like it or not, but we profit from that. So my question will be, or my point will be a little bit like, you know, the Iranian or the Turkish case. I mean, okay, these countries have their own idiosyncrasy. I mean, they got their own questions, you know, but from a European perspective, is what we can do in order to help them, to accompany them. I mean, it's clever for the European Union to reinforce, sorry, I'm getting into your area. Is a clever solution for the European Union to reinforce the conservatives in Iran? Or is a good policy for the European Union to alienate the Western-oriented people in Turkey? Is a good policy for the European Union to do this with Algeria? So for sure those countries have the responsibilities. A very harsh one in some occasions. But it's so easy to say, okay, solve my problems, but I don't want to have any ethical or moral problem or, you know. So I think we Europeans, we also should make kind of reflection of what would be the wiser way to accompany those countries in a more open, democratic, prosperous way of profiting from their energy resources, because this is, to me, the key point. You got countries like Venezuela that cannot profit from the increase in oil prices because their industry is completely destroyed. You got countries like Iran where you can prevent the country to profit from the recovery in prices because you got sanctions. What happened with Algeria? They don't got sanctions. The industry is not destroyed. They are still having the most significant gas industry in the Mediterranean. The most significant one in the southern Mediterranean. Sorry, guys, for the other one. But, I mean, at this point, what should we do with them? I mean, leave them with opportunities. That would be a window of opportunity for Algeria to reap the profits. I mean, we got problems with Russia. There are problems. I mean, why Algeria doesn't raise its hand and say, here I am, I want to do this. My only hope is that finally, after the next presidential elections, we will have somebody in Algeria thinking now is the time to move. We are getting really, really late.
But let me ask you also about this side of the Mediterranean. What could happen with Algeria if we finally go really, and we've talked about this before, to a real energy union? What would happen to Algeria if we really can interconnect Spain with the rest of Europe? Would they really be improved exponentially, their production, their sales to Europe? Instead, I mean, we are the hub for Algeria, but how would that change?
Well, I think there will need to be a well-thought, step by step. The first thing is they need to attract investment. And in order to do that, they need to change not only the laws, but the way of doing businesses. I think there are some propension or proclivity in the last year to do those reforms. I mean, we got a new leadership in Sonatrach in the company, we got a new minister, we got another guy who is the regulatory agency there, and these guys are moving, and they are sending the messages. Over the last year, they have solved most of the problems and the conflicts they had with international energy companies. They have started with Total, for instance. They have started with Naturgy now in Spain, the first company to renew the gas contracts with Algeria. I think that was a very, very nice move. In this struggle, which kind of contracts do we have, or do we want to have? The Algerians say, we want 30 years. The European Commission says 6 months. Okay, we go to the middle, 10 years, if I'm not wrong. I mean, you can somehow get a compromise. I mean, it's not what I want, it's not what you want. I mean, let's do a deal, you know. And for this, I think if we got a good investment in Algeria, so that we can think that over the next 10, 15, 20 years, this country is going to be able to respect their compromises and their commitments, and even to give some new input through renewables. I'm saying in the very long run, really in the very long run, being realistic. But let's give this country some horizon where we can do. So first, this country Algeria have to do their homeworks. They need to reform their laws. They need to change the way the energy sector is working. But thereafter, we need, for these companies getting there, good incentives in order to be ready to export those resources to the European Union or elsewhere. So we need to do a lot of things. And the problem here is not what Algeria can add to the energy security of Europe. Algeria is not going to solve the problem with Russia. It's not going to solve any problem future, for instance, with Qatar or whatever. But if we don't work properly with Algeria, it's not what Algeria is going to add to our energy security. It's what we are going to lose, not in terms of our energy security, but in terms of geopolitical stability in our neighborhood. Algeria won't be there today. I don't think Morocco will stand alone more than a couple of weeks. So strategically, it's really, really important. So they have to do their homeworks. We do.
Let me bring another major geopolitical player here, which is China. When sanctions were applied to Russia, they very wisely moved towards China, and they've made a number of agreements, and they are doing now huge military things together. I mean, exercises together. Is that a way forward for Iran? What is the state of the relationship?
Yes, it appears as if China was the obvious alternative for Iran, looking at the size of the country, the growing economy, the growing energy demand needs, and also the growing rivalry between China and the United States on the global stage. For a number of reasons, I don't think that China is the perfect partner for Iran. First, looking back at the history of Chinese-Iranian relations before the conclusion of the nuclear deal. In 2010, following the implementation of European Union sanctions against Iran, which forced all European energy companies out of the market, Chinese companies took over many projects in Iran with very aggressive commercial terms, exploiting the situation of Iran, with Iran not having any meaningful alternatives, with delivering poor quality and with frequent delays. So speaking to Iranian energy officials these days, they don't have a very positive view of China. And when the Rouhani government took over in 2013, following the new government, Iran even cancelled licenses for Chinese companies at oil and gas fields in Iran amid poor performance in China. And I don't see any reason why this should be different today. China has in the past, and in my understanding, continues to pick very carefully its fights with the United States. As such, China's engagement in Iran, in the Iranian energy industry, will by and large be a function of Beijing's approach to the United States. That could lead to a situation where China increases its engagements in Iran, but I wouldn't count on it from that perspective. And here, interestingly, Europe also does have a very important role. since Iran's position vis-à-vis China, and also Russia, but mostly China, is much stronger than it has a European alternative. Even if that's a small alternative, even if that's a complicated one in light of US sanctions, that improves Iran's cards dramatically if that alternative exists. If Iran is faced alone just with China, I'm not seeing much room for Iran really saving the growth rates in its energy sector.
Okay. Emre, Turkey is involved in a very ambitious energy transition. I'd like you to explain us a little bit how it's going. It's been presented as a model for many countries, as a success story also. But linked to that, I would also like to know how this is fitting with Turkey's commitments to the Paris Agreement and to other international fora towards sustainability.
No, at the beginning, I mentioned that Turkey is a net energy importer country. But on the other hand, it has the vision of becoming a regional energy hub, transmitting center, and re-exporting gas and oil that comes to this country. On the other things, energy policy, it's all the time emphasizing on decreasing dependency on imported energy. And in that regard, they've been focusing on developing local resources. And nuclear was presented as local resource, as I mentioned, and also local coal reserves. Turkey has lots of lithium, which is not in high in caloric value. So also Turkey, on the other hand, is importing coal as well. So we are opening nowadays lots of thermic centrales fueled by coal. Mm-hmm. So that contradicts with Paris Accords, of course, in that sense. Because on the other one hand, you are saying that we would like to decrease our dependency on import resources. On the other hand, you've been giving lots of licenses, subsidies to coal mines, so that you will making the projection that you will decrease your dependency on foreign sources to fuel your electricity in particular. And indeed, if you take it from that perspective, Turkey is a success story in terms of its energy. When you look at, because it was about 50-55 natural gas fueled to electricity, now it turns out to be about 35. And when you look at renewables, of course, it's doubtful to what extent hydro is renewable, but the portion of hydro is now about more than 30%. So, but there are some question marks to the sustainable hydro, particularly the ones applied in Turkey, because you need to cut lots of trees and you need to change the direction of rivers. So in terms of sustainability, question marks. But apart from that, about 7% wind and nowadays, and 3% solar. So in that sense, Turkey, as I mentioned, has the ambition of becoming energy hub in the region, but its peculiar economy, it's, by the way, intensified, highly energy intensity is quite high in Turkey. That's another issue I think Turkish officials should need to focus on, because that means that you need more and more energy in order to come out with that output. So in the first session, it was discussed this decoupling of growth and carbon, high carbon levels in that sense. So this peculiarity of Turkish economy, also high dependence on imported energy, are actually undermining for Turkish prospects in that regard to become a regional energy hub. And also the infrastructure about LNG. So in order to diversify, if you just rely on pipelines, you need time for that. Also Turkey has some capacity problem in storage as well, so that in order to feed its, discourse that Turkey will be a regional energy hub. And also we mentioned briefly about those geopolitical risks in the region, and he was mentioning Syria and also Eastern Mediterranean issue, and your dependence on Russia. These are some setbacks could be for Turkey in that regard.
Okay, let's move now to questions. I don't know if there is any one made by paper, but we have, no, we don't have here. We have here the votes. Is there any question in the audience? because I have many more, so I can continue making questions. Let me, since there are no, I will follow. We didn't talk about Israel, and in the region, talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, talking about gas, talking about Cyprus. What is the role of Israel in all these equations?
Particularly from 2010, this flotilla crisis, we have ups and downs in Turkey-Israel relations. Time to time, we hear about this, Levant region, those Israeli resources, that there are plans proposed to transfer those resources through Turkey than to Europe. But since the political context have evolved, now we are not represented in ambassador level in Israel, so it's one of the historical low levels in that regard. So that caused problem in Turkey's prospects, as I told you, for its energy ambitions to become a regional energy hub, diversify its procurement diversification, which is also linked with the Cyprus issue as well. So you've been mentioning about Algeria, but I think we should need to talk more about Egypt. Mm-hmm. It's Zohr field. To my knowledge, it's more than 800 million BCM in the region, billion BCM in the region. High prospects in that regard. So Turkey has problems with Egypt, by the way. That's another issue. When you look at the economic figures and calculations for feasibility studies, again, Turkey is the closest in terms of if you have a pipeline in feasible in economic terms to bring to take those resources and re-export them to the world energy markets. But I always, from my perspective, politics, not economics actually, are determining those huge energy investments. So now this politics, in terms of politics, Turkey had troubled relations with Egypt, troubled relations with Israel, troubled with relations with Cyprus, troubled with relations with Greece, and Turkey feels itself is isolated in that region. And he was mentioning about EU's role in that regard. And EU is proposing EastMed pipeline that is bypassing Turkey actually, which is contradictory with Turkey's, the way that Turkey perceives exclusive economic zones, the way that Turkey perceives itself in the region. And Turkey, in that regard, feels itself isolated in many regards, plus this coup attempt and issues.
What about Iran? How is the relationship with Israel now?
Yeah.
Is
I'm
frozen?
seeing there's also a question on,
okay,
on Iran and Israel.
Sorry.
It comes to natural gas. Maybe I can link the two.
Okay.
In terms of energy, Israel is irrelevant to Iran. The natural gas that Israel is producing doesn't go to markets that Iran is targeting.
Yeah.
And when looking at Iranian natural gas, and I think that's a very important point, oftentimes overlooked, there's not just oil to the Iran story, but there's also natural gas to the Iran story. While natural gas is used almost exclusively at home in Iran, exports amount to around 5%. And despite announcing ambitious plans to increase exports, domestic demand needs have absorbed almost all increases, and there were substantial, all increases in natural gas production. And I don't see that this will change anytime soon, since natural gas in Iran is the cornerstone for the government's attempt to promote economic diversification based on energy-intensive industries. And if you look at the growth rates of Iran's energy-intensive industries, also parallel to this petrochemical industries, they are substantial in the past years. Iran has even begun, even though at a modest volume, with modest volumes to export processed goods, petrochemicals, but also electricity, steel, cement, and other energy-intensive products. And especially in light of sanctions, I don't see that Iran will change this course of action, because the domestic use of natural gas is much less vulnerable to sanctions. I mean, there is an impact in terms of European companies not being present in the gas industry, and we saw Total being forced to leave from South Pars. But still, during the previous sanctions round, Iran was able to continue grow its natural gas production on the basis of domestic companies. And I don't see any reason why this should change now. And then speaking about exports, Iran launched an export project to Iraq in 2017. And it will increase the volumes of this trade. And in my understanding, or in my analysis, but it won't launch any new export projects in the foreseeable future, in the next decade or so, I would say. So in terms of natural gas, I don't see any competition, even though I heard from Israeli experts that there was this fear in Israel that Iran might possibly, via Iraq, supply Jordan with natural gas. And then Israel moved quick to secure a supply deal with Jordan. But I never saw a commercial or a political case for Iranian exports to Jordan, so that was more a hype rather than a reality in my reading here.
Okay, there is a question for Gonzalo. Could you please give your point of view on the Moroccan-Algerian competition with regards to gas imports to Europe?
Well, I don't know how to interpret this question. Sure, there has been a huge struggle between the Moroccans and the Algerians, mainly, especially, I suppose it is that, yeah? Mainly about the Maghreb-Europe pipeline that goes through Morocco and enters into Spain. Since the new contract with Naturgy has been renewed, there is no problem about this infrastructure getting idle. There were some plans for what to do with this infrastructure if this pipeline were not to be working or there won't be gas to fill it. This is not the case anymore. So as today, I think the struggle between Morocco and Algeria is, why Morocco wants to buy LNG from Russia when it can buy from, neighbor Algeria. Why Algeria and Morocco, they don't develop together a fertilizer industry because Algeria got the gas, Morocco got the phosphates. Why? Because the very reason why we are here, because of geopolitics. That's exactly the case. Yeah? So, to what extent, the friend who studied Algerian-Moroccan relations tell me is that the relation is getting worse and worse. That there is no new thing, more on the contrary. So very difficult situation for both countries. What Morocco wants to do is, on the one side, to develop renewable energies. They are very much pushing for solar and also wind. There is also a geopolitical dimension there because this wind and solar won't only be in Morocco as we know it, but also in the Western Sahara. We have already had problems in the European Parliament with MPs asking what is going to happen with this hypothetical renewable export from the Western Sahara. In my opinion, this is a non-issue because we are very far away from seeing that. Probably they will consume it within themselves. But sure, this starts to pose political problems. Political problems within the European Union to the governments. This is a real problem. So it's not only, and for sure, Algeria is playing also with this Western Sahara issue. So I don't see many problems on the gas competition. I don't see. Well, it's true that the Moroccans are saying that now we are developing. We have found some newfound gas deposits. Perhaps the question was that one. I don't see the Moroccans having enough infrastructure or business experience to develop this in order to make a very tough competition to the Algerians. Perhaps they can buy small cake in the market, but they don't see a very, very tough competition there.
Okay. There was another question about gas and Israel and Iran, but I think that's been already answered. And there is another one which I will ask you to answer very briefly so we can move on, about renewables in the respective countries. You have already mentioned some initiatives, but what is the overview of the renewable?
As I told you, Turkey has this ambition to rely on its own reserves and significant wind and solar potential in Turkey. But on the other hand, the problem again, Turkey is importing most of the equipments to, Turkey has problem R&D in terms of that. And when, as I told you, I'm again underlining when we say renewables, I think we should exclude hydro and focus more on wind and solar. And Turkey is providing lots of subsidies in that regard. In wind, as I told you, it becomes now 7% in its electricity generation. Solar needs to be improved, and also biomass, geothermal, but geothermal is mainly utilized for heating purposes rather than exchange. There are also huge potential in terms of geothermal in Turkey, waiting to be utilized.
Yes, let me start on a positive note. There is massive potential for renewable energy in Iran, for solar especially, but also for wind. And since years, the government is trying to promote the use of renewable energy in its policy plans. The way Iran is going about renewable energies is that it says the private sector, also from abroad, should invest into renewables in Iran and to promote the growth of renewable, especially electricity generation. It's almost exclusively about electricity. There are a number of problems in this context in Iran. And first, one step back, Iran launched a couple of feed-in tariffs and power purchase agreements so as to stimulate investments from abroad into the renewable energy industry. The problems are that commercially, renewables have to compete in a domestic market where fossil fuels are still heavily subsidized. So the gap, there's a gap which is very difficult. And Iran's government sought to overcome that, on the one hand side, by reforming the subsidies, even though that wasn't a particularly successful exercise. And on the other hand, by guaranteeing investors a guaranteed feed-in tariff and return. The problem why this didn't work is that Iran, since years, is confronted with massive inflation, and the return has been guaranteed, or is guaranteed, in Iranian rial. And as an investor, you're in no position today to know how much 1 Iranian rial or 1,000 Iranian rials will be worth in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or whenever your investment materializes. And on top of this, you have all the other international problems with the sanctions, with the banks, with the insurers, the reinsurers, and so on and so forth. So a very complicated story.
Gonzalo, I want you to ask about Algeria, but also there was a question about shale gas. If you can comment very, very briefly on shale gas in Algeria.
I go for both of them?
Yeah,
very, very fast.
please.
Okay. You got, let's say, 3 opportunities. You got conventional oil and gas in Algeria, then you got shale, and then you got renewables. So the easiest thing to do, the lower hanging fruit is, develop conventional. If they had not been able to develop the easy thing, the conventional resources, I'm quite skeptical they are going to be able to develop shale or renewables in the short run. Shale, there are technical problems about water and so on and so forth, about technology, about huge investments there. I don't see it very clear. It's true that they are starting to make contacts with the American, with the frackers and so on and so forth. I think this is my imagination at work, okay? The government need to change the stance and the narrative in the local population, because the local population completely oppose shale. So now they start to change a little, perhaps thinking that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we can work out this new narrative more sensible to shale, and perhaps in the future the people will develop. For renewables, when you look how much do you pay for your electricity bill or your tank in Algeria, you mean everything is subsidy. So how can you develop competitive renewable sources? It makes sense, the strategy makes sense, because they could, let's say, free resources, gas resources for export, because they are having problems in, the reduction and the depletion of the field. So it makes completely sense to try to substitute internal electricity consumption by renewables. I wouldn't try to, to put too much pressure on the Algerian policymakers, because, just doing the reform for conventional, we will be happy. And thereafter, okay, let's start thinking about shale, about renewables. They should do it, yeah, but in the short run, I see it very, very, very difficult. Just for one thing, you need very good policies, you need a huge regulatory effort, you need very competent companies to develop a working, functional, efficient, renewable system. I don't see any of that in Algeria.
Okay. David, last question. I'm sorry, there are some more here, but we ran out of time. About Iraq. What is your opinion about Iraq in terms of security in the region?
Iraq.
Yeah.
Iraq. Well, obviously, Iran has a large stake in Iraqi affairs. Since the collapse of Saddam Hussein in 2003, Iran has increased its political profile, backing a number of political groups in Iraq, also militias. It has played an important role in pushing back against ISIS in 2014 in Iraq. And also on the commercial end of things, Iran is increasing its profile in terms of exports, cars, but also electricity and natural gas. And both countries will remain interlinked for that reason. If we look at one incident this summer, when over debts on the one hand side in Iraq for Iranian electricity exports, and on the other hand, peaking domestic demand needs for electricity in Iran amid very, very hot temperatures and growing electricity needs for cooling, Iran suspended electricity exports to Iraq, to the Basra region, and we all saw the developments over there and the turmoil and the riots. So both countries remain interlinked for good or worse.
Okay, thank you very much. If we can move to the query that we were posing, I think that I saw the result overwhelmingly. I don't see it now, but if you remember the questions, in your opinion, the MENA region will lose geopolitical relevance, gain, or keep being a major player. Overwhelmingly, you have said that they will keep being a geopolitical player by 54%. 23 said that they will lose relevance, and 23 said that they will gain. So it's going to be a...
I think we agree.
Do you agree with that? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your collaboration. Thank you very much, especially to our panelists, for enlightening us about such interesting and critical countries for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina.